January 17, 1946. A cold rain drums against the tall windows of the United States Naval Intelligence Office in Washington, D.C. The room smells of damp wool and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting harsh shadows across a long mahogany table where maps lie scattered like fallen leaves. At the center sits a man in a civilian suit that hangs loose on his frame. His hair is graying at the temples, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his posture remains rigid, unmistakably military. This is Kapitän zur See Hans-Wilhelm von Dresky, former commander of U-boat operations in the Kriegsmarine. Before him, 3 American naval officers lean forward, pencils poised above notepads. Outside, Washington is celebrating the first full year of peace. Inside this room, the war is still being fought, one secret at a time. For 5 years, the Atlantic Ocean had been a killing field. Over 3,000 Allied merchant ships had vanished beneath its waves, torpedoed by submarines that struck from darkness and disappeared like ghosts. The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely a struggle for supply lines or strategic advantage. It was a war of secrets, a contest fought in the hidden depths where men lived like moles in steel tubes, hunting and hunted in equal measure. The German U-boat campaign had nearly strangled Britain into submission, bringing the island nation to within weeks of starvation by the spring of 1943. Yet despite 5 years of desperate combat, despite captured vessels and interrogated prisoners, despite breaking the Enigma codes that encrypted German naval communications, the Allies still did not know the full extent of Hitler's undersea empire. There were gaps in the map, shadows in the intelligence files, zones where U-boats appeared and disappeared without explanation. These were the places the Allied commanders whispered about late at night. The ghost stations that logic said must exist, but evidence had failed to confirm. The German submariners who sailed into the Atlantic expected glory. They had been told they were the tip of the spear, the elite warriors who would bring England to her knees and secure Germany's dominance over the seas. In the early years of the war, this had seemed possible, even inevitable. The happy time, the U-boat crews called it, that golden period from 1940 to early 1941, when Allied defenses were weak and German submarines prowled the shipping lanes with near impunity. Young men volunteered for submarine duty in numbers that exceeded available berths. They wore their U-boat insignia with pride, those silver badges that marked them as members of the Kriegsmarine's most dangerous and prestigious branch. They expected to be heroes. They expected to win. What they did not expect was to spend the war's final years hiding in secret bases carved from Arctic ice and tropical jungle, waiting for supplies that never came, for orders that made no sense, for a victory that had long ago slipped beyond reach. Von Dresky had served in U-boats since 1935, rising through the ranks to command first a single vessel, then an entire wolf pack, and finally to serve on the planning staff at Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the supreme command of the submarine force. He had seen the evolution of Germany's submarine strategy from its triumphant beginning to its desperate end. He had attended planning meetings where admirals drew red lines across ocean charts, designating zones of operation that did not appear in any official record. He had signed requisition orders for fuel and torpedoes, bound for facilities that existed nowhere on Allied maps. And now, sitting in this Washington office, with the rain beating against the windows, he was preparing to reveal what the Third Reich had spent enormous resources to conceal. The Americans wanted names. They wanted coordinates. They wanted to know where the submarines had hidden, how they had been supplied, and who had helped them. Von Dresky had brought something more valuable than any single answer. He had brought a small leather notebook, water-stained and worn, its pages filled with coded notations in his own precise handwriting. For 3 years, from 1942 until the war's end, he had kept a private record of Germany's secret submarine infrastructure, not because he planned to defect, not because he doubted the cause he served, but because he was a professional officer trained to document and organize, and because some part of him understood that history would demand an accounting. The notebook revealed 15 locations. Some were expected, bases the Allies had suspected but never confirmed. Others were astonishing in their audacity and scope. In the Arctic waters north of Norway, beyond the reach of regular Allied patrols, the Germans had established a network of supply points hidden among the fjords and islands of the Barents Sea. Here, U-boats conducting long-range patrols could rendezvous with supply ships sheltered in narrow inlets, protected from air attack by sheer geography. The bases were small, temporary, often nothing more than a tanker, anchored in a hidden bay with a security detail ashore. But they extended the operational range of Germany's submarines by thousands of miles, allowing them to hunt far into the Arctic convoy routes. More shocking were the Atlantic stations. The Americans knew about the massive submarine pens on the French coast, those fortress-like structures built with slave labor and protected by meters of reinforced concrete. What they did not know was that Germany had continued to operate covert supply operations even after the French bases fell in 1944. Von Dresky's notes described a network of signals and rendezvous points stretching from the coast of Spain to the waters off Argentina. German submarines desperate for fuel and food would surface at precise coordinates, flash-coded signals with their lamps, and wait for neutral merchant ships that would transfer supplies in the middle of the ocean. The merchantmen, registered to Spanish or Argentine companies, carried fuel oil in unmarked drums and provisions in crates labeled as general cargo. The transactions took less than an hour, conducted in darkness and radio silence. By dawn, both vessels would be gone, leaving no trace of the meeting. The U-boat crews who participated in these clandestine operations experienced a different war than the one promised in the propaganda films. They had expected combat, danger, the thrill of the hunt. What they received was endless tedium punctuated by moments of terror. Days and weeks submerged in steel tubes that smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies and the chemical stink of the air scrubbers, meals of stale bread and canned meat, sleep taken in shifts on narrow bunks that were still warm from the previous occupant, and always, constantly, the knowledge that the hunters had become the hunted, that Allied aircraft and destroyer groups were growing more sophisticated, more numerous, more deadly with each passing month. The statistics documented the transformation from triumph to catastrophe. In 1940, Germany lost 22 submarines. In 1941, 35. By 1943, the number had climbed to 244 boats destroyed, and the following year saw 249 more sent to the bottom. Of the 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during the war, 30,000 never returned. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of service in any nation's military. The submarines became floating coffins, and the secret bases that von Dresky now revealed had been desperate attempts to keep a dying force alive long enough to influence a war that was already lost. Among the notebook's entries, one location stood out for its sheer improbability. Von Dresky described a facility in the South Atlantic, established in early 1944 on a remote island off the coast of Argentina. The island was uninhabited, little more than a rocky outcrop with a natural harbor on its eastern side. German engineers had arrived aboard a disguised merchant vessel and spent 6 weeks carving fuel storage tanks into the coastal rock, camouflaging them so thoroughly that aerial reconnaissance would reveal nothing but natural stone formations. A skeleton crew of 12 men maintained the facility, living in conditions that bordered on exile. Every 3 months, a supply ship would arrive with fuel pumped from Argentine sources and provisions purchased through intermediaries in Buenos Aires. U-boats operating in the South Atlantic used the facility as a way station, extending their patrols and attacking Allied shipping bound for India and Australia. The Americans listening to von Dresky's testimony struggled to comprehend the resources devoted to such remote operations. Even as Germany's cities burned under Allied bombing, even as the Eastern Front collapsed and the Wehrmacht retreated across France, the Kriegsmarine continued to maintain these scattered outposts. The fuel alone represented an enormous investment. Germany was starved for petroleum, rationing gasoline for its tanks and aircraft, yet somehow the Navy found enough to cache thousands of liters on a rocky island in the South Atlantic. The explanation was ideological. Hitler and his inner circle believed that submarine warfare could still change the war's outcome, that disrupting Allied supply lines would eventually force a negotiated peace. The secret bases were built not from military logic, but from the desperate hope that willpower and determination could overcome industrial reality. Throughout his testimony, von Dresky returned again and again to a single detail, a small thing that seemed to symbolize everything the German submariners had endured. In the secret bases, whether in the Arctic or the South Atlantic, the supply crews always included one luxury item in their provisions: real coffee. Not the ersatz blend of roasted grain and chicory that had become standard throughout Germany, but genuine coffee beans sourced from neutral countries at great expense. The U-boat crews would receive their supplies, the fuel and torpedoes and ammunition, and tucked among the mundane necessities would be a small bag of coffee beans. It was a gift from the high command, a reminder that they were still valued, still elite. The submariners would carefully ration the beans, making them last for weeks. They would grind a few each morning, letting the aroma fill the submarine's stale air, a brief moment of normalcy in an abnormal existence. But by 1945, even the coffee stopped arriving. The supply chains had broken down. The neutral merchants demanded payment in hard currency that Germany no longer possessed. The secret bases began to run out of fuel, then food, then hope. Von Dresky described receiving desperate radio messages from remote outposts, commanders asking for instructions that headquarters could no longer provide. Some bases were evacuated. Others were simply abandoned, their crews left to find their own way home or to surrender to whoever found them first. The last entry in von Dresky's notebook was dated April 27, 1945, 3 days before Hitler's suicide. It recorded a final radio transmission from the South Atlantic facility, a terse message reporting that the station was being shuttered and the crew departing aboard the last supply ship. No coffee mentioned, no glory, just an ending. The Americans spent 3 days verifying von Dresky's information. They dispatched reconnaissance aircraft to the coordinates he provided. They cross-referenced his testimony with intercepted radio traffic and captured German documents. They interviewed other prisoners of war, checking names and dates. Every detail checked out. The notebook was genuine, and the secret infrastructure it described had been real. Naval intelligence began calculating what this network had cost the Allied war effort, how many ships had been sunk by U-boats that should have run out of fuel, how many convoys had been attacked by submarines operating far beyond their theoretical range. The numbers were difficult to quantify, but estimates suggested that the secret bases had extended the effective U-boat campaign by at least 18 months, resulting in thousands of additional Allied casualties and millions of tons of lost shipping. Yet for all the tactical information von Dresky provided, what struck the American officers most was the portrait he painted of exhausted men maintaining a military operation that had lost all strategic purpose. The secret bases represented enormous effort and ingenuity applied toward an unachievable goal. They were monuments to the Nazi regime's refusal to accept reality, its willingness to sacrifice lives and resources for the appearance of continued resistance. The submarine crews who visited these remote outposts understood this, even if they could not articulate it. They went through the motions of refueling and rearming because orders required it, because military discipline held them together even as the regime collapsed. But they no longer believed in victory. They no longer expected glory. They simply endured day by day, waiting for an end that came far too slowly. Von Dresky's defection, if it could be called that, was not motivated by ideology. He did not denounce Hitler or National Socialism during his interrogation. He did not apologize for his role in the war or express remorse for the ships his submarines had destroyed. What he offered instead was a kind of professional courtesy, one naval officer providing information to others who would understand its significance. He had fought his war according to the rules he had been taught, and now that the war was over, he was providing the historical record that military tradition demanded. The Americans understood this. They treated him with careful respect, addressing him by his rank, even though that rank no longer held any official meaning. They were recording the last testament of a military force that had come within sight of victory before being ground down by superior resources and industrial capacity. The maps that emerged from von Dresky's testimony were classified top secret and remained so for decades. The locations he revealed were systematically investigated and documented. Most of the bases had been abandoned and offered little physical evidence beyond some fuel drums and rudimentary shelter. The South Atlantic facility was the exception. When a joint American-Argentine team finally located it in 1947, they found the fuel storage tanks still intact, carved into the rock exactly as von Dresky had described. The camouflage had been so effective that the investigators walked past it twice before recognizing the artificial nature of the installation. Inside one tank, preserved by the dry air, they found a single burlap bag. It contained perhaps 2 pounds of coffee beans, gone stale but still identifiable. Someone had left them behind, either forgotten in the haste of evacuation or deliberately abandoned as no longer necessary. The investigators photographed the bag in place before removing it as evidence. In the classified report, one officer noted that the coffee beans represented the final logistical achievement of a supply system that had stretched across the globe to support a lost cause. The Nuremberg trials were underway when von Dresky completed his testimony. In that more famous tribunal, the architects of genocide and aggressive war faced judgment for crimes that defied previous legal frameworks. Von Dresky was never charged with any crime. He had conducted his naval service according to the laws of war as they then existed. Submarine warfare, even unrestricted submarine warfare of the kind Germany practiced, was not considered a war crime by the standards of 1945. He spent 2 years in Allied custody, not as a prisoner but as a consultant, helping naval intelligence understand the full scope of Germany's submarine operations. He was released in 1948 and returned to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1971. His leather notebook, the document that revealed Hitler's secret submarine zones, remained classified in American archives until 1982, when it was finally declassified as part of a general release of wartime intelligence documents. The story of the secret bases is ultimately a story about the gap between ideology and reality. Nazi Germany believed that willpower and determination could overcome material disadvantages. The secret submarine network was an expression of that belief, an enormous investment in infrastructure designed to extend the operational reach of a force that was already obsolete. By 1944, Allied technology had evolved beyond anything German planners had anticipated. Radar, sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, ahead-throwing weapons, the tools that had turned the submarine from predator into prey. No amount of secret refueling stations could change the fundamental imbalance. The U-boats continued to operate because Hitler demanded it, and because military culture prioritized obedience over practical judgment. The men who died in those submarines, particularly in the war's final year, died not to achieve victory, but to maintain the appearance of resistance. Yet there remains something haunting in the image of those remote bases, the hidden coves and camouflaged tanks scattered across oceans, maintained by skeleton crews who understood that their work no longer mattered, but continued anyway because that was their duty. The coffee beans in the South Atlantic facility, stale and forgotten, represent a peculiar kind of tragedy, not the grand tragedy of battles lost or cities destroyed, but the small tragedy of meaningless gestures, of trying to maintain standards and traditions when everything they represented had already been swept away. The Allied officers who interrogated von Dresky understood this instinctively. They were professional military men who recognized in his testimony the portrait of a service that had fought well and lost anyway. There was no triumph in the revelation of the secret bases, no sense of satisfaction at uncovering the enemy's hidden infrastructure. Just a weary acknowledgement that war consumes everything it touches, that even the most carefully planned operations eventually reduce to exhausted men in remote places, waiting for supplies that no longer come, for orders that make no sense, for an end they can neither hasten nor prevent. In the decades after the war, as documents were declassified and histories written, the secret submarine bases emerged from shadow into recorded fact. They appear now in scholarly works and naval histories, footnotes to the larger story of the Battle of the Atlantic. But the human dimension that von Dresky's testimony revealed, the psychological experience of maintaining a losing war across global distances, that remains harder to capture. It exists in the space between the coordinates and the statistics, in the gap between what was ordered and what was actually possible. The rain that drummed against the Washington windows on that January day in 1946 has long since evaporated. The men who sat in that room, both interrogators and interrogated, have passed into history. The oceans that held so many secrets have yielded them up one by one to investigators and researchers. Yet something of that moment persists. The image of a former enemy officer, carefully explaining the machinery of a war he helped to wage, not seeking forgiveness or understanding, but simply completing the historical record with the same precision he once brought to planning submarine operations. In that act of disclosure, in that willingness to reveal what had been deliberately hidden, there was a recognition that military duty extends beyond combat into testimony, that the final obligation of a professional soldier is to ensure that what happened is accurately recorded and understood. The coffee beans found in the abandoned South Atlantic base were eventually destroyed, too deteriorated to preserve. But their discovery had already served its purpose. They confirmed the final entry in von Dresky's notebook, validated the testimony of a man who had no reason to lie and every reason to cooperate. They proved that even in the war's last desperate days, even when defeat was obvious to everyone except those who refused to see, the machinery of military logistics continued to function, shipping luxury goods to the edge of the world for men who would never enjoy them. It was absurd and poignant in equal measure, a perfect symbol of how ideology drives action, long past the point where action serves any rational purpose. This is what von Dresky revealed when he exposed Hitler's secret submarine zones. Not just coordinates and dates, not just the technical specifications of hidden facilities, but the human cost of maintaining impossible operations to serve unachievable goals. The zones were secret not because they were particularly effective, but because acknowledging them would have required acknowledging how desperate Germany's strategic position had become. They represented not strength but weakness disguised as determination, and the men who served in and around them, who kept the fuel flowing and the coffee packed and the submarines operating, they were casualties not just of military defeat, but of an ideology that valued appearance over reality, gesture over outcome, fighting to the last over surrendering when the fight was clearly lost. The leather notebook rests now in the U.S. National Archives, its pages still legible, its entries still precise. Researchers occasionally request access to examine it, checking facts for histories being written, verifying details for documentaries being filmed. It is an artifact of a lost world, the world of 1940s submarine warfare and great power conflict in secret bases on remote islands. But it speaks to something more universal, the human tendency to persist in familiar patterns even when circumstances have changed beyond recognition, to maintain routines and standards because they provide structure and meaning when everything else has dissolved. The submariners drinking their rationed coffee in steel tubes beneath the Atlantic were not so different from anyone else trying to maintain normalcy in abnormal times, trying to find small comforts in uncomfortable circumstances, trying to believe that what they were doing still mattered when all evidence suggested otherwise. That is the deeper secret that von Dresky's testimony revealed, and it is one that transcends any particular war or ideology. It is simply human, and in its humanity, it endures.